Okay, thank you for having the opportunity to do this video. It's critical because what you're going to be hearing and what I'm going to be addressing is what I call the code of silence. So much information that our people don't know of, neither do the non-Indians. And when I'm talking about that, I'm going to be dealing with a video on inherent rights, one on the treaties, one on the 500 years of Empire Canadian colonial policies, and then there'll be a bigger picture on the Crown Indian Nations Relations video. And on the intellectual property, I wanted to deal with that as well because our elders at the Navajo Nation that met on the environment and conservation a few years ago from Canada and the US, they wanted somebody to deal with intellectual property. And the late Leon Secretaro, who they considered him being their Einstein in Navajo Nation, a very brilliant man, one of our teachers. And he was asked to find someone who would deal with the intellectual property for protection of it. And they pointed to me. So I said, what do you want to do? And they said, everything you have in your head is ours. Everything we have in our heads is yours. Nobody owns intellectual property. I came home to Canada, and 3 weeks later I got a call in the afternoon on a Sunday from Six Nations. They were hosting an international forum of gathering of elders on environment and conservation. And they wanted the same thing done. So they had a group of elders along with Chief Sundown call me. And they said, we want you to do something about protecting our intellectual property. And I said, what do you want done? They said, whatever you have in your head is ours. What we have in our heads is yours. Nobody owns intellectual property. It's all granted to us by the Creator. So that's the way I've been dealing with intellectual property. But they also said there's been too much abuse of our information, our knowledge, and it's being abused by universities and many individuals in every sector. So they said they can use it, but they can't take it out of context. They must understand what it is if they're going to use it, and we must be prepared to police that and guarantee that they're not abusing it. So that's my information on how you deal with intellectual property. On the code of silence, when we talk about the inherent rights, one of the Supreme Court judges who passed on now, Des Lambert, he said, all your rights supersede everything. I got two questions, he said. What are they and where do they come from? So when we look at our inherent rights, we're talking about our traditions, our customs, our practices, our beliefs and our values of our nations and our people. We're talking about our language, our culture, our spiritual affairs. We're talking about our justice, our economy. We're talking about inherent rights to education, health, social development. We're talking about our inherent rights to title to lands and resources. We're talking about the inherent rights to air and water. And many people frown at the issue of jurisdiction for airspace. That's a major source of income and generating revenue that we don't deal with. One nation in the US collects $80 million a year for the use of their airspace for communications and transportation. In London, England, they build really big buildings and tall buildings, and for every section of that building, they charge rent for airspace. Now, that's the type of thing we need to be looking at and talking about. But when we go through the inherent rights, then it also includes the recognition of our inherent sovereignty and the national powers of governing. And most people are not familiar with what the national powers of governing are. So when we look at those national powers of governing, it includes the powers to determine our own forms of government, based on our own traditions, customs, practices, beliefs, and values, but based on our worldview and philosophy of our respective nations. And again, we're not doing that and we're not implementing it. We had it historically, we have it today, and we'll have it in the future. But we must implement it. And how do we do that? We need to have laws in every sector implementing our inherent sovereignty, our inherent rights to self-determination, our national powers of governing, that includes all our internal affairs, external affairs, and international affairs for governing. And when we look at that area of jurisdiction, it also includes the national powers of treaty making. So when we talk about treaties, we don't talk about anything that has to do with the powers of treaty making. We just talk about treaties and treaty rights. You can't deal with the formal implementation of treaty rights if you don't deal with that. But when you look at the inherent rights then, and the national powers of governing, we have to have legislation, our own unique and special forms of law, implementing our inherent title to lands and resources under Inherent Lands and Resources Act that occupies the total field of jurisdiction for our traditional ancestral lands and territory under the treaties, not just the reserved lands by band or community. And when I get into the treaties, you'll see how we reserve different categories of lands by making treaties, exercising the powers of treaty making. So we need a system established that looks at how we implement our inherent rights in every sector. And when we do that, it's going to require a form of law and policy that you can make. And your law and policies have to be based on your traditions, your customs, practice, beliefs, and values for every sector. And you can categorize these inherent rights in 4 categories. When you look at the political rights in that category, you're talking about our sovereignty, jurisdiction, authority, government, laws, and policies, and your territorial integrity, and your councils. The other category is your social rights. It includes your language, education, health, medicines, justice, family, child welfare, shelter, social development, welfare assistance, sports societies. And we don't have those societies anymore. In our traditional forms of government, I'll come back to that. On the economic sector, the category of economic rights, you got your lands, your air, your water, your gathering rights, hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering rights, and your societies again. And along with that, of course, education impacts on all your economic rights. And you got your category of spiritual and cultural rights, your ceremonies, your prayers, your form of worship, songs, dances, lodges, societies again, practitioners, and education again. So when we talk about our inherent sovereignty and our forms of government, we had traditional systems known as the clan systems. And under that process, our clans had highly structured functions of every clan that basically forms what you know as a governing system for implementation of your legislative branch, your executive branch, your judicial branch, and your administrative branch and management. So when you look at the system of governing, when we talk about that process, the non-Indians studied our systems of governing. They didn't have systems to govern like they say they had. They had what you call dictatorships in various forms. So most Canadians have come to Canada come from countries that had dictatorships. They didn't have the systems of governing that they say they had. The US, when they decided to make their constitution, they studied the Six Nations clan system, and they based their constitution on the principles governing the clan system. And when we look at the clan system, we had portfolios in the form of highly structured and disciplined societies in every sector. We had a medicine society, for example. And the nice thing about those societies, many of them crossed the boundaries of all our nations, and they were similar in every nation, like the medicine society. And they were highly structured and organized to the point where they regulated themselves. They organized to share their information on their medicines, their healing and preventive medicines. And they had neutral grounds where they met regularly to exchange all that information and trade on the medicines that they had. Now that's just one example of highly structured and disciplined societies we had and still have, but we're not implementing them. So when we look at our own traditional systems of governing, we need to have it in place today, something in writing. Some are using constitutions. We use conventions. When my wife Elsie and I do the work on governing structures, we use a convention, which is a political agreement between the family members of the communities, of the bands. And they can structure themselves along the lines of the kinship clan system. And the functions there can be similar. But again, we're not going there. And why do we have to go there? The reason we have to go there is because the powers of governing are with the people, the individuals and families of our communities. They're not with the leadership. So that's the basic foundation. When we talk about the basic foundation of our traditional systems of governing, spiritual affairs is involved in every sector, including the political sector. Non-Indians say that those are separate and distinct processes. Their spiritual religious process is separate from their political process. One of the things that I was taught at an early age is that we have the issue of politics, and people don't understand and realize that there's politics in everything. So when we talk about the inherent rights in every sector, there's the politics of it that you have to deal with. Now, what am I talking about? There's political agendas that people are not familiar with. And today, many of our leaders and our managers are spending most of their time on administrative agendas, without dealing with the implementation of the political agenda that I just highlighted for you. We get nowhere. And most of the presentation I'm doing now on inherent rights, inherent sovereignty, inherent title to lands and resources, that's a political agenda, not an administrative agenda. So when we look at the source, like Judge Lammer wanted to know, what are those inherent rights? So I just listed them for you. And they're not limited to that. But what is the source of those rights? Well, today we're caught up in what is called the rights holders, a political coin termed by the government, again, to divide us and control us. When we talk about the source of inherent rights, inherent sovereignty, and the inherent right to lands and resources. And those are inherent rights by sector, like I just done and highlighted for you, identified for you. Those are granted to our nations and the peoples of our nations by the Creator. They come from no other source, and they're not granted by a treaty, they're not granted by a constitution. That's the fundamental way that we have been granted our rights, our inherent rights, by the Creator. And we inherit them from generation to generation. At birth, your child, male or female, is born with those inherent rights, and they inherit them from generation to generation. Now, when we look at the inherent rights that we have, the inherent sovereignty we have, and the inherent title to lands and resources that we have, this is another area that I call the code of silence. How do we implement them? Well, we have the responsibility collectively to implement our inherent sovereignty, implement our form of government, our form of justice, our form of education, health, social development, and so on. Now, when we talk about the process of implementation, why aren't we defining those inherent rights and our inherent sovereignty, our inherent title to lands and resources, and all those inherent rights we have? Why are we not defining them in our respective languages? How? Based on our respective philosophy, worldview, traditions, customs, practice, values, and beliefs. Now, many of those are similar. The principles are certainly similar and the same throughout our nations. But we can't even come together by nation, never mind between nations, on how we deal with implementation and enforcement of them, and how we interpret them for application and implementation. So now we have them interpreted. What are we doing to identify what the duties, the collective duties and responsibilities are for each one of those inherent rights? Our inherent sovereignty, our national powers of governing, our national powers of treaty making, and all the rest of our inherent rights that I have identified for you. What are we doing now to identify what those duties and responsibilities are that each of us have and that we have collectively for those rights, the inherent rights? Now, you see, the elders will tell you that the collective rights reinforces individual rights. And there's a fundamental difference between inherent rights and indigenous rights, Aboriginal rights, human rights, and treaty rights. And that is a major difference. Now, I want to go on, first of all, of implementation. So now you've identified them, you've defined them, you've identified the collective duties and responsibilities we have for implementing them. And when we look at that, what are the plans and strategies you have to implement them in every sector? What are your plans to implement your sovereignty? What's your plans to implement all those other inherent rights in every sector? When you know that, when you have those plans developed, what form of unique and special laws then do you have for implementing them? So we can take other examples of how we implement inherent rights. To do that, we have to have a traditional system of education, of health, of social development, of justice, of economics, of shelter, and so on. Many of you continue to apply and implement your language, your culture, your traditions, your customs and practices. But we need to step that whole thing up, that whole process up. And as you know, much of that was outlawed through the colonial policies that I'll cover later. But when we look at the implementation then, what forms of traditional institutions did we have? And what forms of structures did we have for governing? We need to talk about that, and we need to implement that. So our ceremonies and our traditions and customs are coming back today. As you know, they were all outlawed. But we need to step it up in 2020. And you'll see why when you review the colonial policies that are being implemented today. Now, when we look at the whole process then of implementing our traditional systems and institutions of governing, today we're isolating ourselves by band, by community, not recognizing that we had national institutions for governing, like the clan system and kinship system, like the societies we had in every sector. They weren't just by one community or one group of Indian people. They were collective institutions and structures of governing of our nations, not just by community. So your community, your band, is one community and one political unit of your nation. And again, we don't go there. We don't talk about that. We don't deal with that. We talk unity, but unity is empty unless we discuss how we're going to implement it. Now, when we look at justice, we have the restorative justice system that focuses on harmony and balance in family, in community, in societies of our nations. They have punitive systems, punishment. Nobody takes ownership and responsibility for anything. In our system, whoever commits the crime or violates the law has to make restitution to the individual, the family, or the community, whoever they offended, and they have to make sure that they replace whatever they damaged or they stole. That's our system of governing, of justice. And we do that in terms of governing practices. When do we come to the table to discuss the interface of government, jurisdiction, and law? Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the equality of governments, jurisdiction, and law. Governments of Indian nations, the federal government and provincial government. But internally, we need to discuss internally the interface of government, jurisdiction, and law by community or band, if you want, but between the bands of our nations, between the bands and the tribal councils, an agency of our nations, between the bands, the tribal councils, an agency council, and the Federation of Nations. Now, when we look at the Federation of Nations implementing our sovereignty, it's the nations that make treaties. Treaties do not make nations. So everything I'm telling you about today is what existed and what we have today and what we need to implement for the future. So when we talk about moving ahead with our own justice system, our own inherent education, health, social development systems, we need to be prepared to discuss how we form and construct law that scopes out the whole inherent rights in every sector and prepare unique and special laws for implementation. The day is gone where we can rely on oral evidence and teachings and information. Many of our people today, the older people, have not been taught and don't know any of that because they're products of residential schools. But we still need to do that. And when we look at how we do that, we then come together in a real way of unity and structuring our powers of governing collectively as nations. So in the Federation, most people don't even know that we developed and implemented in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, moving from the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians under provincial corporate law to a convention forming the Federation of Nations by convention through a political agreement. It's a political agreement that we put in place, and the political agreement is mandated by the membership of every band, because that's where the powers are. And we traveled for 2.5 years to every community to get them to ratify that convention, that political agreement. So that political agreement is ratified and legally and politically recognized under our government jurisdiction and laws and our powers of governing. Now, when we look at that convention, a political agreement forming the Federation of Nations, how did we implement the governing bodies? Well, we developed the Convention Act, and the Convention Act governs all the governing bodies of the Federation of Nations. The Executive Act, the Executive Council, which is the executive and the reps from the various tribal councils, the Intergovernment Commission, Act of Chiefs, Executive, reps, and elders. And when we look at all the other governing bodies, like the Legislative Assembly now that we have of the Federation of Nations, that's a lawful assembly of our governing bodies, implementing their powers of governing as leaders of our nations. And the business there should be the business of the nations. But today, it's not being implemented. FSI Inc. is still being implemented under provincial law and jurisdiction. So our assemblies don't exist in the form that they're supposed to be. They're now back to conventions, taking away the lawful political recognition of our lawful assemblies to get lawful political authority and mandates and to make law. And when the assemblies make law, that's supposed to be taken back to the communities for ratification under the Convention Act. So we need to move forward on implementing the Convention of the Federation of Nations, because it provides for the recognition of the political autonomy and the governments of every community, every band of the nations. But there's conditions to that recognition, because implementing sovereignty and the principles of sovereignty apply to every community and every band in the same way. The national powers of governing apply to every band and community in the same way through their governments. So there's many things that apply in the same way. I just gave you a listing of all our inherent sovereignty, inherent rights by sector, inherent rights to lands and resources, and those are no different from community to community, from band to band, from government to government of our nations, and no difference between our nations. Those inherent rights apply to every one of our nations in exactly the same way. Not just here, but right across Canada. But when we have our sessions, our meetings, our assemblies, like I said, they're changed to conferences now. So many of the 3/4 of the agenda that you deal with in those conferences are administrative agendas. And what I just highlighted for you up to now is a political agenda. And the political agenda is never on the table for discussion and debate for how we move ahead collectively on implementing them. So we need to be ready to deal with that collectively, not reacting like we do to federal, provincial initiatives. We need to occupy the field with our own laws and jurisdiction, every sector, when I talk about the implementation of inherent rights and treaty rights. And I'll come to the treaties in a moment on another section, another video. But when our people exercise the national powers of treaty making, how did they do it? Well, everything that I highlighted for you, the inherent sovereignty, the inherent title to lands and resources, the inherent rights in every sector, those are reserved by treaty making. They're recognized by treaty making, they're confirmed by treaty making, and they're guaranteed by treaty making. So then, when we exercise the powers of treaty making, we not just have inherent rights, but we now have treaty rights as well. And I'll go into more detail and information on the powers of treaty making and the treaties. And when we look at this whole process then, that I just highlighted for you, how we exercise our sovereignty and implement our national powers of governing, national powers of treaty making, implement our inherent rights in every sector, and in the inherent title to lands and resources. That's how we implement the UN Declaration on the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples. We have sovereignty, so we're entitled to implement the UN Declaration, not just the federal government and provincial governments of Canada. Now, that UN Declaration has been validated for implementation and recognition by many countries of the world. And I understand that some of our people are rejecting the UN Declaration. We have our own people that spent years, and they gave up and sacrificed a lot to get that declaration recognized for implementation. Why are we suggesting that we want to reject it? My question to you who wants to reject it is, what is your alternatives, if you have any? I'd like to hear them. But right now, I don't see any alternatives in the UN format and the UN forum. So that's my process in terms of how we look at implementing the UN Declaration. But again, the code of silence. Nobody knows nothing about the Organization of States Declaration. And Canada, it's the Organization of American States, like North America, South America, Central America. Canada belongs to that organization. And they adopted a declaration similar to the UN Declaration. But we're not using that. Why? Why are we not using it? Well, because most people know nothing about it. That's why. But again, we're sovereign, so why aren't we implementing it? Now we look at the process that we need to move on. These are collective duties and responsibilities associated with our inherent sovereignty, our national powers of governing, national powers of treaty making, and all of our inherent rights in every sector. Our inherent title to lands and resources, not just on reserve by band or community, but throughout our ancestral, traditional treaty territories. That's our duties and responsibilities that we have. Now again, when do we come together as communities and bands of our respective nations? And when do we come together between our nations? And we're not going to achieve that unless we go to discuss the interface of government, jurisdiction, and law between ourselves, between our nations, between our governments, and between our peoples of our nations. Those are critical issues that I'm asking you to examine. I'm not telling you. I'm highlighting what I know. I started Indian politics when I was 15. I have now spent 63 years in dealing with the political agenda that I'm talking about. And there's a political agenda in everything. And there's political agendas and political issues in every sector, every area, including church and religion. Highly structured political activity in religion and church. And you know about that. But getting back to us then, and how we move ahead with this political agenda collectively. It's critical that we do now, because we set it aside in the last several years, and there's reasons for that as well. But they're not acceptable reasons, because we're implementing now those colonial policies we fought against historically and just recently. So I'm talking about the recent ones in the form of the 1969 White Paper and the 1980 Buffalo Jump. So I'll be doing a video on the 500 years of colonial policies, Empire Canadian colonial policies, and how they've impacted on us and how they're being implemented today. How they were implemented in the past, current, and how they'll continue to implement them in the future unless we take formal action collectively to implement the inherent rights that we have. Now, I said earlier, there's a fundamental difference between the rights that you speak of. You have inherent rights, you have indigenous rights, you have Aboriginal rights, you have human rights, you have treaty rights, you have native rights, all that type of stuff. Well, what's that fundamental difference? Well, I just highlighted for you the foundation for the inherent rights that we have. And when we talk about that, we're talking about inherent rights, inherent sovereignty, inherent title to lands and resources that are granted to our nations and the peoples by the Creator. Indigenous rights, Aboriginal rights, come from the Empire Canadian colonial policies and law and policy. The human rights are man-made laws, only recognizing individual rights, not collective rights. Our inherent rights are collective rights that reinforce individual rights. But now we have treaties and we have treaty rights that are validating many of our inherent rights, our inherent sovereignty, our national powers of treaty making. And when we talk about Indians, Métis, and Inuit, yeah, there's distinctions that have to be identified and implemented. But again, for the Métis and non-status Indians, all the inherent rights, inherent sovereignty, inherent title to land and resources that I just spoke of, if you deny those, you lost the foundation for your rights. And many of you have denied them because you don't want to be recognized as Indian. Well, I'm afraid that your ancestry comes from Indian heritage, inherent rights of Indians, and so on. So how do you implement them? That's something you have to discuss and deal with collectively. And again, what I highlighted for you in this video is a total code of silence amongst your people. So when we look at the whole process then of all these inherent sovereignty, inherent rights by sector, inherent title to lands and resources, I ask the nations and the leadership of the nations and the peoples of the nations, what are you doing collectively to implement them and give them legal effect under your government jurisdiction and laws? When do you come together to discuss the interface of government jurisdiction and law, respecting your relationships, your political relations, your treaty relations, your judicial relations, your economic relations, your fiscal relations, and your international relations, and how you move ahead with implementing inherent rights, and now treaty rights by sector, under your governments, under your respective governments and nations, collectively. That's under your government jurisdiction and laws for implementation and enforcement and giving them legal effect. We have many of our own people, including some lawyers, that don't speak to the recognition of our jurisdiction and our inherent title, but also our inherent legal system that we have, we had, we have, and will continue to have. So it's time to deal with that resistance that's there. They exist and they're recognized through the comprehensive legal political framework that I'll be dealing with in another video. The fact is, everything that I just laid out are facts, and they're not Saul Sanderson's facts. They're facts that exist based on the source of our inherent sovereignty, our inherent rights by sector, our inherent rights to lands and resources. Now we talk about the inherent rights to lands and resources. What's the fundamental foundation for that? Well, many of you know. The fundamental foundation for that is that we are connected through our sovereignty, our spiritual and cultural beliefs and practices to all the lands and resources. That's the foundation. So where is our inherent title to Lands and Resources Act that occupies the field for those lands and resources throughout our traditional ancestral treaty territory, not just only reserved by ban? And many of you are implementing the Land Management Act. That's fee simple land status under federal jurisdiction. And when they implemented the Indian Act, Section 9124 of the BNA Act, where it made the federal government responsible for Indians and Indian lands, it didn't make them responsible for ownership and control of Indian lands. Those are reserved by treaty making. And how are they reserved by treaty making? They're reserved by the sovereignty of our nations remaining intact in the title to the lands and resources for traditional ancestral lands and resource territory, and for all the other categories of lands that are reserved by treaty making. And I'll identify those when I come to the video on what we reserved by treaty making for lands and resources under the powers of treaty making and the treaties we have today. So I'm going to stop there for a few minutes and take a little break. Thank you.